Okay, let me just start. I want to just give you quickly a kind of thumbnail sketch of European migration, just basically a roadmap, really, for thinking about the overarching contours of the history of European immigration. And then specifically, I want to talk about some of the major ways that different immigrant groups, strategies that they adopted to deal with the setting that they were entering, and especially those kind of negative aspects of it that we've been talking about. So first of all, just in terms of the demographics of European immigration, this is really, in some sense, if you're looking at the gross numbers here, it's a story of statistical bell curves, if you can imagine that. And again, think of that I have a timeline behind me, even if I don't. So initially, as I said, I mean, in the 17th century, the migration from Europe to the British colonies was for the most part English, and heavily predominantly English. And then increasingly over time that became less the case. And in the 17th century, it's predominantly non-English. In the 18th century, it's predominantly non-English. And in the 19th century, it gets more and more complicated. Within that, for each sending country, you have a kind of statistical bell curve that stretches out over time and indicates numbers. So in some cases, like the Irish, there's a calamity, and the bell curve might be quite steep. Like suddenly, like there's a few immigrants, whoa, a couple 100,000 of them, and the bell curve then. I mean, the Irish, we tend to think of the famine migration as the 1840s, but it's a steep bell curve, and then it trails off really slowly. So I mean, millions of Irish are still arriving much later in the century, and even on into the 20th century. A group like Germans. There's no real calamity. There's the revolutions in Central Europe in 1848, which maybe spurs a little bit. But for the most part, German immigration is over a much longer period of time. It's much steadier, and the bell curve is pretty gentle. It's very gentle. It slopes up, and it stretches out decades, and then kind of gradually slopes off. And in general, if you were to draw all of those bell curves on your timeline, in general, what you would have is a picture of peoples coming from Western Europe, and then Western and Northern Europe, and then Southern and Eastern Europe. And the bell curves would get steeper and steeper, and taller and taller, and shorter, and they would also represent peoples from further and further south and east of Europe. The causes for these statistical migrations, which by the way are enormous. I mean, between the Civil War and World War I, 26 million immigrants come, of which, I mean, the overwhelming majority are from Europe. Now, some of them return. In fact, significant numbers of them return, and we don't really know how many. Among some groups, like Italians, it was very common to come and go. Among other groups, much less so. Jews who fled Tsarist Russia tended to come and never go back and never look back. So it's different from group to group, but in a general way, I mean, the 26 million aren't necessarily 26 million who come and stay. That represents a more complicated movement. Ellis Island is opened in the early 1890s to federalize that whole process. So of the 26 million, 12 million come through Ellis Island. So when we talk about the Ellis Island immigration, I mean, technically we're talking about 12 million people from 1893 to mid-1920s. But as a kind of shorthand, for using Ellis Island to represent Europe, we're talking about a much bigger migration over a much longer period of time. Okay, these statistical bell curves are always in response to some kind of localized condition. So it's the famine in Ireland. In China, there are taxation issues where suddenly the government is demanding tax payments in cash or gold right at the moment when steam travel is making it possible to travel out of China, and right at the moment when gold is being discovered in California. So there's a kind of really locally specific political and technological reason that we start to see Chinese migration at a particular moment. There's an earthquake in Italy that is disruptive and displaces a lot of people. The revolutions of 1848, which I mentioned, which might dislodge people. And then in some cases, there's just the new availability of steam travel. A steamship line is put in between Hamburg and Baltimore, which just has the fluky result of beginning this huge stream of German migrants from Hamburg through Baltimore, which is, it's huge. I mean, it could have as easily gone to New York. It could have gone to Boston. It went to Baltimore, which had all kinds of impacts on this country's culture and where the Germans ended up. So they ended up not only in Baltimore and the mid-Atlantic kind of lower eastern seaboard rather than the Northeast, but then their migration routes tend to stay on the southern axis, Cincinnati, St. Louis, right? So the spread of German population and German culture, it takes shape for these kind of fluky, localized reasons. So in looking at any particular group, you're not just looking at the cultures and traditions and the kind of political outlooks or worldviews that they brought with them, but you're also looking at kind of the structural features of their migration and what causes what. Now, this is all within a general context of global economic trends that are spurring new kinds of migration in every which direction all over the place. And that's one of the disservices we do ourselves as Americans when we think of our kind of exceptional history as a nation of immigrants. We tend to think of, oh, the world wanted to leave where they were and they wanted to come here because this is such a great place. Well, okay, maybe for some of those people, but people were going all over the place. And people were going from Europe to South Africa. They were going from Europe to Argentina. They were going from the countryside of Poland to Warsaw, or the countryside of Italy to Rome. Short-term, long-term, transatlantic, people were just on the move. Now, why is this? It has to do with global trends in industrialization, urbanization, the growth of capitalism, in ways that shook people loose from their former ways of life, even if they weren't in the centers of what was going on. Let me just give you a kind of sketch of how that works. What could happen is, even if you lived in the so-called hinterland, you lived either in a small town, a village, or the countryside, whether it's in Tennessee or in Ireland or Italy, you're farming, you're doing subsistence farming, your family might have some kind of small-scale economic thing going on that's producing things for barter, whether it's woolen goods or you're spinning textiles or you're growing things, but your concerns are very local, and cash is really not in your pockets, it's not in your world of concerns. Most of what you get by exchange. Suddenly, someone in your town, usually a major merchant, sometimes one of the larger landholders, someone develops some kind of economic relationship with a faraway city. And that changes his, and it's always a him, by the way, changes his economic requirements, and it changes his relationship to you. So now there's someone who's running the local general store, and even though you're a couple hundred miles from Warsaw, he's indebted to people in Warsaw because he's buying finished goods from them, or he's buying bagged seed from them, or whatever it is. Suddenly he needs cash from you. And he needs it on a different timetable because he's dealing with a banker in Warsaw, or a banker in Nashville, or a banker in New York. Gradually, more and more people in that setting get drawn into at least a partial wage economy, whether or not they're trying to. Suddenly, they're answerable to someone who has a new relationship with this rising economic regime of an industrialized, standardized, cash-hungry industrial regime. And more people get drawn into it. Farmers stop farming for subsistence and start drawing up their lots differently and farming for market. When they farm for market, they start having relationships with people who transport goods. When they do that, they need more cash too. I mean, one by one, the people in an area start to be displaced. A family might decide they're not going to farm for just themselves anymore. They're going to farm a single crop for market, which means they might suddenly want to send their youngest children away to go somewhere else and give their, instead of carving up their land 5 ways and giving it to their 5 children, they carve it into one lot, they give it to their oldest kid to raise something for market, and then the other 4 kids have to go somewhere else, whether it's, Dublin or Boston. This gradual growth of this new economic regime is displacing more and more people globally as the 19th century progresses. And so that by the end, more and more people are becoming displaced by this kind of thing, but also urban centers have more and more to offer. The growth of industry in these periods just has an immense hunger for unskilled labor. So there's a sense in which the engines of industry in the U.S. really need the millions of unskilled workers who are coming from all over the world. Which is, to go back to what I was saying about race, one of the ways of thinking about race in American political culture is it's one of the ways that the political culture tries to resolve the tensions between an economy that seems to need everybody and, remember that fragile experiment of democracy that's kind of afraid of everybody, right? So the economy is bringing in those 26 million that I talked about. The political culture is kind of a little bit squeamish about that, and racial thinking and the politics of race is one of the ways that those things are worked out. But in general, the labor and economic historian David Montgomery this is one of the greatest ways of thinking about this. He said, take a globe and draw a circle, okay? The circle, start with East China, and then draw across the ocean to Toronto, and then go further still across the Atlantic to Northern Europe, and then go maybe just east of Warsaw and start to curve south. Continue your circle, take in Italy, and then go back across the ocean and just include Louisville, Kentucky, and then San Francisco. He said in the latter half of the 19th century and on into the 20th, everybody in the world outside of that circle was trying to get to all the places inside that circle. And that's a really great way to kind of think about the flows of population that we're seeing, both long-term and short-term. So people from Russia are going to Warsaw, but they're also going, to New York and Chicago. In any case, that's, in addition to these localized things that are jarring people loose, whether it's a famine in Ireland or an earthquake in Italy, that's the general thing that's going on globally that's really helping to explain these massive movements of millions of people. And then, as I mentioned before, the technologies of travel are making it more and more possible to make these moves. Okay. So the economy needs these peoples. The political sense of the culture, certainly the white Anglo-Protestant elites, are a little bit unsettled by these population movements. And so there's this real ambivalence towards immigration, and always has been, at least since the Irish migration of the 1840s, and certainly we see it today, and that's something that we can talk about more. Now, the history of nativism within this, and we've said some things about this, but let me just kind of fill in some of the history here. So we have the Free White Persons Clause that's going to allow all these people to come in from Europe. The different waves of response to the migrations start, and I'm sure you've heard about a lot of these, but maybe not all of them. The Know-Nothings are really the first major kind of anti-immigrant party, and it's really in response to the Irish, and it begins. There are a couple of ways of looking at this. One is that the Irish migration is just in numbers that no one had seen before, and that no one had imagined before. So it's the first time that hundreds of thousands and then ultimately millions of people are coming ashore within a pretty short time. And it's absolutely transforming. It's absolutely transforming the places of arrival, particularly places like Boston and New York and Chicago, but not exclusively those places. So one of the responses that we see, part of it is just response to change. And this is something that we're seeing right now too, I think, that nativism becomes one of the languages for expressing all kinds of discontent, some of which really don't have that much to do with immigrants themselves. So people who lived in nice, quiet, homogeneous, smallish cities like Boston suddenly found themselves in huge, sprawling, industrial, heterogeneous cities that they didn't necessarily like. And protesting the change often took the terms of protesting the Irish, who kind of represented the change. So that's part of what you see. Part of it is, in the case of the Irish, the Catholicism. So the Know-Nothings, it's really about, you know, the safety of the Republic, the future of the Republic. Can the Republic withstand this onslaught of papists and Catholics? But as I said, it's as early as the 1850s. It's within the context of the Know-Nothing Party and the Know-Nothing movement. They're called Know-Nothings, by the way, because it's a secret society, and if anyone asks you, you're supposed to say you know nothing. It's within the context of the Know-Nothings that you start to see a kind of racialized language of who the Irish are. You know, not just impoverished people who represent the transition and the really harsh, let's face it, the really harsh transition to a rapidly industrial or industrializing economy. But people who inherently are impoverished because that's the kind of people they are. They're no good, and you can just see it by looking at them. The next kind of major wave of anti-immigration sentiment that you can give a name to is the anti-Chinese movement, ironically, of which the Irish are among the spearheads. And it really starts in San Francisco and spreads. And it continues, by the way, because the Chinese Exclusion Act just singled out the Chinese, even though probably if people were thinking at the time that other Asians might come, they probably would not have couched it quite that way. But it just named the Chinese. So in the wake of Chinese exclusion, you start to get Japanese and South Asian immigrants. And so the anti-Chinese movement kind of becomes an anti-Asian movement over time, especially in the Western states, but not exclusively. In the 1890s, the biggest kind of nameable anti-immigrant organization is called the Immigration Restriction League. And this is the group, and one of the, I won't say founders, but one of the really influential figures in this, I mentioned earlier, he's a Massachusetts senator named Henry Cabot Lodge. And he's one of the people who really brought that kind of scientific thinking that we've talked about overtly into the discussions of immigration. So the Immigration Restriction League is associated more with the 1890s than any time after, but there's a sense in which you can see that moment in the politics of immigration as the beginning of what will become the Act of 1924. And all of the debates that unfold between the 1890s and 1924 kind of have that stamp on them. And it's not just Lodge, but a lot of his colleagues, people that he knew from Harvard. In fact, there's this historian of eugenics who says you can actually trace eugenic thought to one class in Harvard in 1888, and you can find like 7 people who basically went on, Lodge being one of them, 7 people who went on to kind of propagate this kind of thinking that would become a kind of standard way of talking about the immigration question specifically, but humanity in general. And so that from the Immigration Restriction League, you get a series of kind of intellectual stances that become more and more associated with science and with the disciplines and psychiatric categories, for example. The standard intelligence test that we still use, the Binet, what's it called, the something Binet test? Stanford Binet, was invented in exactly this context, and the first people who took it were people at Ellis Island, and it was a way of weeding out what were delicately called at the time the idiots, who were trying to come ashore. So modern psychiatry and psychological testing and intelligence testing is another part of the kind of scientific advance of not just an anti-immigrant politics, but again, a politics that's really rooted in ideas about human hierarchy. And then you have the 1924 law itself. So immigrants are coming, and they're coming for good reason. Everything's changing for them where they are, whether it's the cities or villages or countryside of their home countries. There's something very inviting about the industries that are really blossoming worldwide within that kind of industrial belt that I described, but particularly in the US. So there are good reasons for people to come, and come they do, but then they aren't always met with the most welcoming stance on the part of the people who are already here. So I want to just talk about some of the strategies that different immigrant groups adopted, or some of the ways that immigrant life was shot through with the strategies that dealt with, not just life in a new world, but life in a what could be a very hostile environment of the new world. Okay, so one, and I alluded to this before, is the kind of internal group politics of assimilationism on the one hand versus a kind of pluralism on the other. Are we going to make our case that we're just like those Anglos who are here and that we're worthy of inclusion in this polity? Or are we going to say, no, we're completely different, but we have gifts to bring to the table? And within a lot of the immigrant groups, you can see these battles raging, especially in immigrant newspapers. I mean, this is where a lot of these fights took place, and different leaders would emerge representing different stances along that spectrum, from assimilationism to pluralism, and it could get very complicated because often, business elites, for example, of a given group, Germans in Cincinnati, the Irish in Boston. Business elites, on the one hand, had a real stake in the group's general standing, especially if they had ambitions that went beyond the group and they wanted to, hold a city council seat, for example. They had to have the respect of the host society. And so there's a kind of politics of respectability among business elites that enforces a certain kind of assimilationism. On the other hand, often those same business people, their main clientele is their ethnic group, and they have every reason in the world to want that group to always want whatever the ethnic thing is that they're selling. And so they also have a stake in a kind of insular, inward-looking, cultural retaining kind of set of social practices. So it's not always simple to kind of parse out pluralism and assimilationism. There can be a lot of contradictions, but in general, these are positions that are political and they're strategic, and they have power politically in terms of how groups are trying to define themselves. So that, in the post-civil rights era, we tend to like the pluralist position more. I mean, that's just kind of in general, as Americans of the late 20th century, early 21st, we just kind of like it more when people own who they are and are proud of it and claim it and announce it. In most cases, anyway, or especially if we're looking backward and not looking at the present. But it's important to see, and it's often hard to see because of those kind of preconceptions of ours, it's hard to see that assimilationism is actually a pretty radical position to take. A good example of this, some of you might know the book, Mary Anton's book, The Promised Land, which in some ways, I mean, she's a Russian Jewish immigrant who becomes a very successful English language writer, and she becomes kind of the darling of a lot of the people of the literary establishment in Boston. The Promised Land, in a certain sense, is the most elaborate articulation of an assimilationist position. I mean, she says, the first sentence of the book, I think, is, the person who is telling this story is not the person who lived. I have been made over. I have made myself over. And the whole story is about that trajectory she was on, starting out as a Russian Jewish girl in what is now Poland, and ending up as a good American. And it seems assimilationist in that it seems to be a kind of rejection of self, maybe not self-loathing, but at least a kind of, I am not that. I have become this, and I'm proud of that, and it's important, and look who I've become. In the context of the time, though, that was a really radical position, because the Immigration Restriction League was saying that was not possible. They were saying, this girl can never become anything but what she is because she's a Hebrew. So her position is an assimilationist one, yes, but it's also a kind of radical rejection of the dominant politics of immigration at the time. And it's an announcement to the world that, yes, look what we are capable of. Look what we can become when given the chance. Reassess. When you see, and this is a paraphrase, but the sharpest language I'm about to use is hers. When you see that greasy immigrant, on the street, you realize that that's me underneath, me with my elegant English, me adored by your literati in Boston. Every immigrant you see is that person underneath. So it's a stance that has a pretty sharp political gusto to it in a way that I think is often lost on us in a post-civil rights era, because it's a political stance that seems to be based on a rejection of self, but in fact it's a different kind of protest. A second strategy, and in terms of European immigration, this affects fewer groups than in the case of Asians. We talked about it briefly earlier, but that's through the courts. Using the courts, and this is really important in Asian immigration in terms of petitioning for citizenship rights. But there are groups that now, in the context of a later historical moment, that we, even though technically they aren't European, we do think of them as European groups, and we think of them as being kind of basically white. Groups like Armenians, who have kind of become, within the Caucasianness of Caucasian America. At the time, Armenians were a group that had to fight those battles in the court, and were seen by judges as not being white enough, not being the white of the Free White Persons Clause. So in their case, the courts were very important for gaining rights in the first place, and then other groups used the courts as ways of not just gaining fundamental rights, but ways of protecting the group. And so, not that most groups were litigious in any way, but the courts were an important institution that often could, potentially anyway, recognize a group in ways that other people on the scene would not. A really important one, and again, the politics of this are a little bit complicated, is nationalism. Again, we would think of this as a kind of non-assimilationist stance. I mean Old World nationalism. Irish nationalism among Irish immigrants, Zionism among Jewish immigrants, Polish nationalism or Czech nationalism among those groups. Now, this became very common, and it's kind of puzzling. Why is it that someone would leave the homeland, come to the U.S., and then spend the rest of their lives just completely immersed in the politics of the homeland? Why would that be? Two reasons. The most fundamental is that in the cases that I just named, massive migrations outward were, by definition, taking place during moments of national calamity, or local calamity, or regional calamity. The famine in Ireland, the anti-Jewish violence in Tsarist Russia, the kind of political, there was a period where Poland was divided in three and conquered, and Poles were kind of held in various forms of conquest by the three neighboring powers. So these are the things that got populations moving in the first place, and went into the stories they told themselves about why they were leaving and why it was necessary to go. There's a sense in which nationalism as a political movement was often either aspiring to or claiming to address exactly the calamity that was the spur to migration in the first place. So that, in a sense, immigrant populations were kind of selected for as really fertile fields for nationalist thinking, because they'd been hit directly by the calamity underhand or at hand. So that's one piece of it. The Irish nationalist argument becomes very sensible to the Irish who have been displaced by the famine and now find themselves in a place like Boston. They are, direct victims of exactly the thing that Irish nationalism says it's going to address. And often they've left people behind that they really care about, and so nationalism is a way of kind of remaining connected to those people and doing what they can for them. The New World dimension of that is there's also this thought that we will be more respected if our nation is more respected. An independent Ireland will make the Irish paupers of Boston a more appealing population to those who look down on us. So this is something you see. The Irish is probably the best example. Zionism is interesting because, I mean, even the state of Israel isn't established until much later, but even in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, 1890s, around the turn of the century, you start to see a kind of mobilization around the idea of a Jewish state. And it could be in Palestine or it could be somewhere else. I mean, that was up for grabs at the time, and there were different ways of debating it. But the idea of a Jewish state was really important as a way of saving all those people from Tsarist Russia, and also, again, a way of making Jews a more respected people in the world in a way that could have a real effect for the Jewish immigrants in the U.S. And one of the things that is important about nationalism is how kind of saturated a lot of immigrant cultures were by nationalist thinking. I mean, it's not just a political orator on a soapbox on a corner talking about nationalist principles, talking about we have to get out from under the Saxon heel, or we need land reform or whatever it is. It became enmeshed in the immigrant cultures in various ways. It shows up in immigrant newspapers, not just as editorials and editors and immigrant intellectuals, articulating a political position, but it becomes the stuff of poetry, song, story. It's often woven into vernacular religions. For example, Polish Catholicism is a brand of Polish nationalism in that a holiday like Easter is all about the resurrection of Poland. It's not just about the resurrection of Christ, it's about the resurrection of Poland. Irish Catholicism, again, is also shot through with all kinds of meanings that have to do with Irish history and Irish oppression and the ways that Catholicism has been suppressed historically in Ireland. So these movements, like if you were to go to a nationalist meeting, you might do a count in one way and come up with a conclusion about how important nationalism was to this group. But when you look across the culture and look at a lot of the different institutions and the ways that meaning is being carried and being disseminated, nationalism, old world nationalism is very, very, very important to a lot of these groups. And again, it's related to strategies of how to better the position here at home. And in fact, I mean, this is one of the reasons, the depth of this, and I talked about the saturation of the culture, this is one of the reasons why generations later, Irish nationalism in some ways is more powerful in the US among Irish Americans than it is in Ireland itself. And the same thing with Zionism. You will find in the US a much kind of harder line, narrow, powerful Zionist position being articulated than what you will see in Israel itself. In Israel, the spectrum is this wide. And among American Jews, the spectrum tends to be about this wide. And it's because these old world nationalisms go back and are rooted in immigrant cultures and are rooted in the experience of displacement and migration and resettlement, and now have been kind of informing the culture over a number of generations. Okay, another arena for self-defense is labor and labor activism, things like the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, which was really a group that was really ecumenical in terms of who it allowed in. But it also, because of the timing of it, the Irish were very important to that movement. And in fact, at the time, there were a lot of people made jokes that we we hammered the gavel and adjourned the meeting of the Knights of Labor, and then immediately hammered it again and called to order the Clan na Gael, right? Because all the people in the room were Irish. But labor was important, and again, the politics of this are contradictory and difficult, because one of the slanders against the immigrants was that they would underbid American workers, they would depress wages, immigration was a bad thing, wages couldn't withstand it, they're too docile, you know, they're gonna let their bosses get away with things that Anglo-Saxons never would, it's really gonna hurt the standing of American workers. This was basically the stance of the AFL, American Federation of Labor, when it was first founded at the end of the 19th century. Very much a kind of anti-immigrant politics rooted in a politics of labor. On the other hand, the other slander is they're radical. They come here with their socialistic ideas. They're a bad bet, you know, for the country, because they can never Americanize. They don't value individualism the way we do, right? So there are these two opposing slanders, both of which are rooted in a politics of labor, both of which are anti-immigrant. Within this context, and in the context of industrializing America, ethnicity and immigration and labor were very important, and labor organizing was one of the things that was really important to a lot of these groups. It worked out in a couple of different ways, and businesses and management and factory owners and the like tried to manage this to the detriment of workers. They would often purposely hire people from different ethnicities and especially different language groups, and try to make it impossible for their workers to coalesce because the language barrier would be too great. Or, you know, garment workers in New York would purposely seat, they would alternate at the sewing machines, they would alternate Italian speakers and Yiddish speakers so that the workers could never talk to each other. But even despite that, because of the way that immigrants found their way into work in the first place, I mean, we talk about chain migration, right? You come over, you bring over members of your family when you can, so more and more people come, and as they come, they already know some people who are here. Residential patterns are very much shaped by that, but so are occupational patterns. So you get certain ethnicities really dominating a particular arena, whether it's Polish meat packers or Jewish garment workers or Mexican smelt workers in Texas or whatever it is. Chains, you know, ethnic associations and ties and kinship ties and the like were very important to how occupational contours took shape. And then within that, you know, matters of labor and dignity and wages and all of that also took on a tinge of kind of ethnic pride and ethnic self-protection. So union activity was a really important aspect of the ways that some immigrant groups in some places organized themselves and really, you know, tried to advance their own cause. Another arena, particularly for the Irish, and we touched on this earlier, but I want to say more about this, is electoral politics. You know, the Irish ward boss became a kind of iconic figure in the 19th century. And, but over time, most big city political machines found ways of including different groups as groups. I mean, that's what's important. It's not just that there's that the presence of a certain person or a certain neighborhood was kind of included into this heterogeneous mass. It was more that the machines organized along lines of ethnicity, and I'll say a little bit more about how that happened. The way it got started, though, and the reason that the Irish, more than any other group, took advantage of it, it's about where you come from and it's about timing. And for the Irish, both things were really important. First of all, I mean, huge numbers of the initial Irish immigrants were actually Gaelic speakers. This is something that we tend to forget, or that's kind of played down in the literature. But a huge number of them had experience with English or were also English speakers. So that was important right there. I mean, they came in speaking the language of the host culture. They also came in even if they had been its victims, they came in with experience of Anglo-Saxon kind of political structures and ways of doing things. And they came in with that experience at a very particular moment. Catholic emancipation, as it was called, in the 1820s, was the broadening of the franchise to the Irish peasantry in Ireland. So, you know, just a generation before the famine hit and millions of immigrants or emigrants start fleeing Ireland for the US, that previous generation, for the first time, they're getting some experience with the principle of political participation, voting, making their power work, understanding how there's a power of numbers in poverty, and that because the poor will always outnumber the rich, if you can kind of figure it out, you can use those numbers to exert some leverage in a political arena. So they come to the US with that as a kind of fresh experience, so that's really important. But they're also arriving just at the moment where the kind of small shop-based mercantile city of an earlier period is becoming the bustling industrial city of the 19th century. And the structures of cities themselves, but also of city governance, are changing. So the Irish are part of that change. But they're coming right at the moment when city government is expanding. It's taking on more and more tasks for itself. The franchise is broad enough now that you can actually not only organize a mass of voters, but you can, because of the ways that the structures were drawn up, you're organizing people by neighborhood, because city councils, you vote by ward. I mean, there's a kind of geography to the American city as it's growing that favors a group that's coming in huge numbers and settling in one part of the city. And if that group has some experience with this kind of thing, they can go far. And the cities, for the first time, have goods to dispense. The city is going to take on some welfare functions. It's going to take on things like policing the city. It's going to take on things like public education, right? So if you can gain a little bit of power, you can also have some things to dispense. And ethnic loyalty can be a really important kind of oil to that machine. So the Irish are kind of the first to really move in and to kind of think about city governance in that way. But they're doing it right at the front edge of what's going to be a huge era, an epoch, really, of immigration of different groups. And one by one, and the configurations are different from one city to the next, but one by one, other groups kind of find ways of finding their niche in these political machines. And you know, there's this great passage. Actually, this is a great thing to use in the classroom. There's a reformer in Chicago named Jane Addams. I'm sure a lot of you have read 20 Years at Hull House. She runs a settlement house. She's working a lot with immigrants. She's well-intentioned. She's very smart. She knows what she's doing. She's politically pretty savvy. She's describing her relationship, but there's this one passage where it just occurs to her, for the first time, she really sees it as she's working with these poor immigrants, that really the only person who's really doing anything meaningful for them is this really corrupt alderman who she's always been trying to unseat. And she's always thought of him as just like, you know, he's the scourge on the American city. He represents everything that's wrong with the governance of our city. And then it's like the light bulb goes on and she gets it. And she sees that he is really, for all the talk of the do-gooders like herself and all the talk of reformers, this corrupt alderman is really the one who's delivering the goods. If you were, you know, an immigrant, poor, at street level, of course you would feel a profound allegiance to this guy. And it kind of changed the way she thought about the whole relationship. That was a really important arena for a lot of individuals, because you could work your way up the machine, but for a lot of groups. And that was really important. Again, remember, this is in the era, for the most part, the era before any kind of federal welfare policy at all. So anything you were going to get was either going to come from the local level or was going to come from the church. And the political machines, as corrupt as they were, and they were corrupt, found ways of funneling much needed goods and services to the people who needed them most. And then finally, in terms of strategy, just in a general way, community institutions, because the numbers were what they were. Because the numbers were what they were, because there was this tendency for groups to settle more or less in the same area in a city. And again, I mean, it's important to remember how heterogeneous cities were. Like when we talk about the Lower East Side of New York, we think of it as, and this is the Yiddish or the Jewish Lower East Side. Even in a neighborhood like that, it might have only been 40%, that group. I mean, there were a lot of different people on the scene. But what gave a neighborhood its character were its institutions. So where the major Polish Catholic Church was would be kind of thought of and understood as the Polish neighborhood. Where the Irish Church was, or a certain alderman's office or something might be the Irish section. Where a certain newspaper was, or a labor hall, might mark a neighborhood in a certain way. So it's really the institutions that that gave the character to different neighborhoods, or that anchored them in a certain way. But nonetheless, for the most part, in the cities that were taking in huge numbers of immigrants, just the movement and settlement patterns themselves kind of shaped different sections of the city, such that it was very easy for people to kind of live within their own cultural world. As unhinging as the experience may have been under the processes of migration, there was a lot of cultural continuity for many of the immigrants, just because of the cultural environment they were able to build here in the U.S. And I mean, things from the parish play to professional theater, immigrant newspapers, bookstores, coffee shops, church and temple. I mean, there really was a kind of marked cultural life for a lot of groups that was a kind of buffer against some of what the wider world in these cities had to offer at a time when immigrants were so, if not despised, at least the host culture was kind of wary of them. One of the books, I'm sure a lot of you have read it or heard of it, is called The Uprooted. It was written by Oscar Handlin a long time ago, like 60 years ago. It's a beautiful book. The subtitle is something like it's The Uprooted, the epic story of immigrants coming to America, or something like that. He went to Harvard in the 30s, wrote this book, I think, as a dissertation in the 40s. It was published around 1950. It's a beautiful book. It's lyrical, it's powerful, it's a great read. It's wrong about a lot of things. Still worth reading. It's wrong. And one of the reasons it's wrong is he really tells a story of alienation. He tells a story of immigrants being swept along by forces they don't understand, which is kind of believable, right? You're a peasant from the countryside outside of Cork, and now you're living in Chicago. How could you understand that? Well, historians in generations since have discovered that, well, in fact, we think of immigrants being kind of pre-capitalist, and they find themselves in this industrial capital setting. Historians now are saying, no, migration is actually a capitalist strategy. And the people who underwent this were already so enmeshed in these forces, they understood them perfectly well. And they used them, and they had their networks, and they helped their kin. And migration was a family strategy. And sometimes it left the configurations of family, kind of binational or transoceanic. But people understood these forces very well. Or Handlin will say, they were so alienated because of the world that they found. And it was so different from where they had come from. And now historians in the last couple of decades have said, if you look at the world they built, they didn't lose everything. They weren't being swept along by forces they didn't understand into areas that they couldn't recognize. They actually made the world recognizable to themselves by the institutions that they built, the things they carried with them, the things they never let go of, the orientations that continued to be theirs. So there are a lot of things in that book that you might find yourself arguing against as you read it. But one of the things that is really worth hanging on to, that we have lost, I think, in the kind of post-60s ethos, or the post-60s generations of the people who are doing this kind of research and doing this kind of work, he does have a sense of how hard the life was and how bitter the experience was for a lot of immigrants. And that's something that has changed in part in recent years because there's this new kind of romance of immigration. It's a story we like to tell, and we like to tell it in a pretty rosy way. And one of the things that's interesting about this, think of Ellis Island itself. Ellis Island, okay, so the law passes in 1924. Ellis Island is used for a couple of things after that, but then it just kind of falls into disuse and disrepair. In the 1950s, there's an idea that it ought to be opened as an immigration museum. And it's not. And the reason that that idea fails is that in the 1950s, A, most people had never heard of it and had no idea what it was. It was very hard to win any support for the project. And secondly, the people who did know it knew it from firsthand experience. They were there, they remembered it, and they hated it. It was not this big welcoming gateway. It was not a place that told a cheery story about America. It was a place, it was their first site of alienation, in a way. It was the first site of American hostility. Ellis Island wasn't just a welcoming gateway, it was a place where people were screened. The people were detained. There are 27 buildings on Ellis Island. None of them have anything to do with the museum that's there now. In fact, it would be easy to visit the museum and not know that these 27 buildings are there. The 27 buildings are detention cells, medical buildings, the kinds of places that were really wretched, terrifying, horrible places to be. And a lot of people spent a lot of time there. A lot of people spent time there and were sent back. And even though the numbers of deportations from Ellis Island are not terrific, they're about 2%. But when you're talking about millions of entrants, I mean, that's thousands, tens of thousands of people who were turned away by Ellis Island. That's thousands of families who were affected by that story. So Ellis Island, you know, we call it now the Isle of Hope and the Isle of Tears. It really was the Isle of Tears. 1965. Well, first, 1958. John F. Kennedy writes a book called Nation of Immigrants, and it's the opening salvo in his idea to liberalize immigration policy, to finally undo all of the racial slanders and everything else of that 1924 law that's still in effect. And his main idea is not just to liberalize immigration law, but the idea is to make it so that all of those family members left behind in places like Ireland and Greece can come over. He writes the book in 1958. The idea of the nation of immigrants becomes more and more of a familiar idea, slowly. After his death, LBJ picks up the idea of liberalizing policy. It's really part of a much bigger kind of civil rights vision. There's the civil rights movement on the one hand. There's, you know, eradicating some of the racialized ugliness from the political culture on the other. And the immigration policy is one piece of that. When Johnson signs the new, more open immigration legislation in 1965, he goes to Ellis Island to do it, so that he can sign it on Ellis Island with the Statue of Liberty in the background. And that's the moment when Ellis Island, as we tend to think of it, starts to come back into American consciousness. And in the wake of that, now there's a renewed effort. Now let's turn this place into a museum. Let's celebrate immigration. And over ensuing decades, that begins to take place and ultimately does take place. The museum is finally open. And again, this is kind of against the backdrop of the American bicentennial. How many of you are old enough to remember the bicentennial in '76, where we just started thinking about history in a different way. Everyone wanted history. Everyone wanted their own history. Everyone wanted to know the forgotten histories of everything. And in the kind of post-civil rights ethos of, oh, we're going to think about diversity in a different way, suddenly the idea of plural American histories became not just acceptable, but almost de rigueur. I mean, you had to do it. You had to tell the story in multiple ways. The Ellis Island story is one of the things that fit that new ethos very well. And it's around the bicentennial that the real money starts to be collected for the project. The museum opens in 1992, and now this forgotten island, the island that nobody knew about in the 1950s except the people who knew it well enough to despise it, has become the jewel in the crown for the National Park Service, and more people go there each year as tourists than ever came through there as immigrants. Now, the romance of this is important because it encourages us to forget a lot of things about immigration. Some of the things that it encourages, first of all, It encourages us to think about the immigration story as the American story in a way that's really problematic. And this goes back to the first thing I told you, 3 hours ago about when we think about the peopling of North America. European immigration is one of many stories we need to keep in our head. It's not the story, and it doesn't offer the template for any other story. It's its own thing. And it's important, and it encompasses 26 million people, but it's one of many stories, and we need to think about it always in relation to these other stories. The Ellis Island romance also, it's become a kind of point of American nationalism in that it encourages a story about America, not just a story about immigrants, but a story about America that's a pretty self-flattering and pleasing one. This is why, does anyone remember where George Bush went on the anniversary of 9/11 to give his big 9/11 speech? He went to Ellis Island. The Bush family has nothing to do with Ellis Island, right? But Ellis Island, if you're going to go in front of the world and say you should support us in our war on terror because we're such an open, great society, Ellis Island's a pretty good place to do that. If you adhere to certain myths about what the place is and what it means. So there's a story that's been encouraged by our enshrining of Ellis Island as a sacred site. That's a kind of nationalist story. It's not just an immigrant story, it's a nationalist story, and it's one that we need to kind of question and be skeptical of and pierce through and displace. The stories that we tell about Ellis Island also encourage us, and this is, I'm getting back to Oscar Handlin, he was right. This was a difficult story for a lot of people, and it wasn't a pretty one, and maybe things worked out for a lot of families over time, but it's, for a lot of people, a lot of immigrants, it's something they didn't exactly choose, right? They were displaced. If all things being equal, they would have stayed in Cork. So it wasn't as forward-looking, enthusiastic, and eager a project as we might like to remember. And though we like to tell ourselves about how open our society is, the people that they met upon arrival at Ellis Island and who they may have been surrounded by in places like Boston and New York were not always exactly welcoming either, and we need to keep that in mind. So to close this up, I'll just say, I mean, the thing I want to encourage as you teach about immigration in the classroom, which is something I love doing, and you can usually count on a bit of energy and enthusiasm from at least some of the students in the room, is to teach them to hold a lot of these contradictory stories in their head at once, which is a good way to teach history anyway. Because if you're telling a simple story, you're probably doing some kind of disservice somehow. But in immigration, if you can teach them to think about, oh yeah, European immigration, that is a story of white privilege, and it's also a story of, being a pariah in a new setting. If you can tell both of those stories and have students really understand it, then I think you've done something. And now we can just talk about whatever you want to.